Welcome, my friends, to another edition of More Bad News, brought to you as always by Camel Cigarettes. Take the Camels Challenge, smoke Camels for 30 days, and see for yourself what Camels can do for you. Remember, my friends, that when more doctors smoked Camels, America was the greatest, wealthiest, most powerful nation on the face of the earth. So take the Camels Challenge and see for yourself not only what it can do for you, but what it can do for your nation. You know, friends, when people ask me what Camels has done in my life, I have to say that from the time I began smoking Camels in 1967, my life has been transformed. I can't imagine surviving my last 2 years of college with their drug-driven all-nighters. While others may have been partying with their drugs, I used mine to get through exam week and get my papers done. None of that would have been possible without Camels. You can't drink coffee and take amphetamines and stay up all night long working and preparing for final exams without smoking. So I wouldn't have made it to morning without Camels, and Camels has been my companion ever since. I never saw myself as a smoker. I would stop smoking on Friday before Shabbos, and I would start smoking again after Shabbos. Periodically, I stopped for entire weeks or months or years. After my mother died, I would always buy a pack of Camels on her yahrzeit, and it would take me about a month to smoke the pack, one cigarette each morning with a cup of coffee. I have very fond memories of smoking with my mother's Salems and Cools with black coffee in the morning when I visited her after their retirement in the foothills of the Sandia Mountains in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I remember my mother telling me the story about her after her first heart attack, that the young surgeon told her in a very serious voice, asked her, "If you don't stop smoking, you're going to die." And I said to him, "And if I stop smoking, I won't die?" Listen, young man, I have raised 6 children to adulthood, and I've lived with the same man for 50 years, and I'm going to die smoking. And of course, smoking was one of my mother's great comforts. She had been smoking since she was a teen, and smoking brought her memories of good times. What most people don't appreciate is that tobacco smoking is a way to overcome alienation. If you can bum a cigarette from someone, you can strike up a conversation. And once you light up, you have already made a step towards intimacy, which is why offering a cigarette to a woman in a bar was such a hot gesture. Yes, let me light you up. Come on, baby, light my fire. Camels have always been my sponsor for the past 30 years. They've never objected to any of the content of my shows, even though that sometimes it was been uncomplimentary to my sponsor. Through thick and thin, Camels has been there for me. So when I say take the Camels Challenge and see what it can do for you, I'm talking from experience. Camels changed my life. Well, my friends, it's been another week of very bad news here, and I've had to deal with contractors, insurance adjusters, and automobile service departments. I think I mentioned last week that Jasper, my mobile computer system, was warning me that various systems were not happy, and it was time to spend some money on repairs. Mind you, I never argue with an algorithm. In my experience, it just doesn't pay. So Jasper had to spend a day at the dealers where they were diagnosed and they repaired the problem. And my son Isaac came to drive me to Grand Rapids to take me to the dealer so I could pick up my car. And on the road ahead of us, a car had a blowout. They pulled off to the side. And I've been with Isaac many times before. He just pulled right ahead of them, and he put on his respirator. Isaac doesn't wear an N95. He wears a respirator. So he put on his respirator, gets out of the car, and this guy with a respirator is walking towards you, as if you're in some kind of toxic zone, but he doesn't want to get too close to them, and so he says, "Would you like my help?" And they immediately, at first, they're really just traumatized by the whole experience, and nod. And then Isaac goes back to the back of the truck, and he gets out these 3 red cones, which he puts on the side of the car by the highway, so that now there's a little protection from the highway. And then he goes and he gets these treads that he's got in the back of his car, so that the car can be moved onto these metal treads that would keep the car secure. Then he goes out and he gets, his own jack. They had a little donut and a tiny jack that would never have worked with a soft gravel on the side of the road. So Isaac gets this whole thing up, and they're just standing around now, much more relaxed. And I got out of the car and went over and I said, "You're in good hands." And the mother, smoking, by the way, said, "Yeah, I can see that." And in a half an hour, we had them on their way. So uh, all I can say is that the world is a better place with my son in it. Uh, Nothing has been done yet to my kitchen, which awaits the arrival next week of a civil engineer and a mold expert. Both experts will submit plans of mitigation, and hopefully we can all agree on something and let the demolition begin. It's just like preparing for a colonoscopy. Everything about it is unpleasant, but it can't be avoided. And once the process begins, it's entirely out of your control. And of course, I'm not living in a little bubble. Last week, the New Yorker reported the rise of child labor from the New Yorker. You may think that child labor was abolished a century ago, at least in the United States. That was never quite true. The Fair Labor Standards Act, passed during the New Deal, outlawed oppressive child labor, but exempted agricultural work, and many of its restrictions, which in the decades since has left hundreds of thousands of children in the fields. In every industry, enforcement of the law has been uneven. States have been free to strengthen the protections or to weaken them, which some did. But challenges to the federal standards have been rare. The Reagan administration, in its pro-business zeal, proposed lowering the standards, but it abandoned the idea under a fire of teacher, parent, union, and Democratic lawmakers' assaults armed with Dickens references. Today, however, child labor in America is on the rise. The number of minors employed in violation of child labor laws last year was up 37% from the previous year, according to the Department of Labor, and up 283% from 2015. These are violations that were caught by the government, so they likely represent only a fraction of the real number. The surge is being propelled by an unhappy confluence of employers desperate to fill jobs, including dangerous jobs, at the lowest wages possible, and a wave of unaccompanied minors entering the country. More than a little human trafficking, and a growing number of state legislatures that are weakening child labor laws in deference to industry groups and sometimes in defiance of federal authority. The reasons offered to justify these initiatives often emphasize child welfare. A spokesman for the Ohio Restaurant Association testified that extending the hours of work for minors would cut down on their screen time. Arkansas Republican Governor Sarah Huckabee Sanders recently signed a law ending the requirement that 14 and 15-year-olds need to obtain their parents' consent before starting work. Linking the bill to parental rights, the governor's office called the permit an arbitrary burden on parents. So Republicans want to relieve the parents of the burden of approving their 14-year-old's child labor permit. The point that I would like to make in regards to this is the direction that we're going. The campaign to end child labor in America is over 100 years old, and the progress had been made. But just as life expectancy is now running in reverse, so too there are other indications that we are going in the opposite direction. It's not hard to understand why child abuse should be on the rise. Our civilization and the resources needed to perpetuate it are in decline. The New Deal presented a moment of American history where the nation was so rich and powerful that it was able to imagine anything was possible, that the world was plastic and that it could be molded, and that one could even imagine making a war on poverty. But that all ended in the 1970s, when the reality of growing political and economic competition from Europe, the communist world, and the so-called third world, or non-aligned nations, began to undermine American global hegemony. I mean, there was a time when we ran the show, and that is no longer the case. Remember, America was the world's largest slave labor market until 1865, and Jim Crow segregation didn't end until 1965. For most of its history, the United States has been a brutally oppressive place for Native Americans, African Americans, Mexicans, Asians, transsexuals, homosexuals, bisexuals, women, and poor white people. Great for everybody else. But then, back then, the nation state was still more powerful than corporations. That is no longer the case. In the authoritarian world that we live in today, Corporations are more powerful than nation states. And this week brought the collapse of yet another social media ecosystem. We all witnessed what happened to Twitter, a social media network that had originally developed over a decade, for 15 years, and was extremely powerful network that was important to many, many people. And it was destroyed when one single person bought the whole thing. Reddit, another amazing social media ecosystem that is even older than Twitter, was felled this week by the same corporate greed that destroyed Twitter. You can think of Reddit as an ecosystem, something like a coral reef, a place where lots of living creatures gather around to help one another live. And while it takes a decade or more to build such a complex system, they can be destroyed just as quickly and with just as much devastation as the effects of a hurricane or a tornado. At any rate, if I'm right, the entire edifice of the New Deal and Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid will not survive the collapse of our society under the pressures of climate disruption and political violence. It's pretty clear to me that we are not looking at an election in 2024. We're looking at a struggle for power that will be waged by a Republican Party with Trump as its presidential candidate, despite federal and state indictments. Republican strategists know that they cannot win elections, but they can seize power. And that is the plan. That was the plan of the white Confederates after the Civil War. They knew that they couldn't win elections, but what they needed to do was to seize power. And they did that by violence, systematic political violence, which kept Black people away from the polls. Well, my friends, I set myself up for Father's Day with a special edition last week, a letter to my father. So when I realized that this was Father's Day, I realized that I needed to say something about my dad. I didn't experience my father's brutality. He never hit me. I've been through traditional Freudian psychotherapy where you meet with a therapist for 4 to 6 hours a week to hash through your memories and to try to figure out how you came to be suicidal and how you might climb out of the pit of depression that you find yourself in. I called my therapist Uncle Bert. And so I explained to Uncle Bert that my father never hit me. He hit all my brothers, but he never hit me. I was the golden child. After watching the Benny Goodman show starring Steve Allen in 1956, I told my dad that I wanted to be a famous clarinetist like Benny Goodman. And my dad went out and he bought me a Boozy Hawk clarinet and hired a young musician to teach me how to play the clarinet. I remember that whatever I dreamed might be my future, my father was there to encourage me. So after my bar mitzvah, after having been the center of attention and the recipient of more presents than I'd gotten in my entire life before that, I realized how much reward there was for the effort to read my Haftorah. But something else happened during my bar mitzvah that moved me in a more profound way. After reading my Haftorah, still in the synagogue, when the relatives were praising my amazing abilities, one elderly aunt came to me and said, "Your Zeta would be so proud of you." It was a moment of epiphany for me. That is who he was. The old man with the beard who spoke that strange language. That was my Zeta. And I was suddenly overcome with a profound sense of loss. He was my grandfather. I hadn't really realized, it hadn't sunk in. He was gone and I would never have a chance to know him. And I wanted to know his world. I wanted to know something about him. And I decided that I wanted to become a rabbi. My dad arranged for me to get private lessons from a young rabbi who was teaching at our local synagogue day school. Yeah, after school. You know, you'd go to the synagogue had their own little program, and you'd go for an hour to Sunday and 2 days a week, and you'd learn just enough to be able to say the prayers in Hebrew and get through your bar mitzvah. The idea, however, was to prepare me for a Jewish day school. But to do that, I would have to learn to read Rashi. And Rabbi Lieberman gave me my first pair of tzitzis. He arranged for me to go to Camp Torah Vodaas, an Orthodox sleepaway camp in the Catskill Mountains. And I came home from camp at the age of after my 13th birthday. I came home from camp a fanatically religious person who announced that I could not live in an unkosher home. Instead of smacking me in the head and beating me until I pissed blood, my parents decided to discard all of their kitchenware, buy all new pots and pans, and for dairy and meat, and transform our home into a kosher home, had only my Zeta been alive to see it. My father's cruelty must be seen against the background of his own experiences in life, which included being forever disabled in childhood by diphtheria and osteomyelitis, which resulted in hip surgeries that left him crippled, one leg 6 inches shorter than the other. He wore a prosthetic boot all of his life. He wanted to be a teacher, but the diphtheria had destroyed his voice, and my brother's memory of his raspy voice was accurate. But what kind of burdens did this young cripple have to deal with? He told stories of being mercilessly abused and learning to fight back. My mom lost her dad at age 14. When she began smoking that summer. She remembered feeling trapped and miserable and wanting to have some fun. She wasn't religious, and she was thinking of marrying an Italian boy who was a suitor, but chose Harry instead. He certainly cut a dashing figure at his wedding in his wedding pictures. And oh, so let me show you here. Here's my dad at his wedding. You know, my dad and mom at their wedding. And as long as I'm showing pictures, here's my dad in 1944. And here he is holding, I believe that's Marty, his first son. At the foundation of the theory of relativity, oh, I realize you can't see those things. Let me do that again for a moment. I'll share the screen. Okay, and then I'll show you. So here is my dad at his wedding. Here he is in 1944. And here he is with Marty. Get this out. At the foundation of the theory of general relativity is the idea that everything in the universe is moving rapidly in many different directions. Here on Earth, we're spinning in a circle, and we're circling the sun, and we're circling our galaxy. Meanwhile, neutrinos are swarming past us, and through our planets without even noticing that we exist. But despite all of this motion, the laws of physics remain the same for all observers, regardless of the speed or size or direction that they're going in. The idea behind spatial and general relativity is that everything in the universe obeys the same laws. One of those laws, the second law of thermodynamics, says that entropy always increases, and that is the direction that we are headed in. Disorder. We're going from order to disorder. Nothing is going to change that. That's the direction, and we're headed to that direction to the point where we will cease to exist. All I can say is, I love my father, and his memory, despite everything, is still a blessing for me. That's it for this week. Have a good week. I'll see you next week with another edition, hopefully, Emir Hashem, of more bad news.